Now we'll get into Redux, except we'll focus on Redux alone, no React in this section. So our objectives are to define what Redux is, describe actions and reducers in Redux, and to describe methods on the Redux store. So Redux is a popular state management library, and it is created by Dan Abramov and Andrew Clark. It's inspired by Facebook Flux and Elm. Flux is an architecture that Facebook came up with that helps solve the problem of how to manage large applications, and Elm is a functional programming language not written by Facebook. Redux models the application state as a single JavaScript object, which means there's only one place where all your data in the application is stored if you put all of your state in Redux. And the last point about Redux is that it's often used with React, but it's a completely independent library. So you could use Redux with Angular or Ember or any other library you choose, but it pairs very nicely with React. So to install Redux, it's as simple as npm install --save Redux. Now let's talk about the first important concept in Redux, an action. So an action is just a plain JavaScript object, but it must have a key named type, and that type value should be a string that represents some action that you want to take in the application. Now you can have more than just the type. So you can have keys like an ID. If this is a delete action, you can use the ID to help identify which piece of state you want to delete, but the type at the minimum is what you need in order for it to be a valid action. Once you've created actions, the next step is to create a reducer. And a reducer essentially decides what new state to return given the old state and the current action. So in the example below, assume we have some state with a key called login that decides whether or not the user is logged in. So our old state is one parameter, and the action that is currently being dispatched is our second. Now we'll switch on that action.type, and remember type is a required key. And if the action type is logout user, then we'll change the state for the login to be false. But if the action type is login user, then we'll change the state for the login to be true. If this reducer doesn't know what to do with the action, then it's always a good idea just to return the state as is. So after actions and reducers, the last important concept is a store. And a store is just one big JavaScript object that represents our state in the entire application. There's a Redux method that you can use to create a store, and the create store method takes your main reducer for the whole application. That main reducer is often called the root reducer. So far we have an action which is dispatched to cause a change in the state, a reducer which decides what those state changes should be when an action gets dispatched, and then a store which contains our actual JavaScript object of keys and values for the state of our application. If you want to change the state, like I mentioned, you want to dispatch an action from the store. This dispatch function will dispatch an action, and the type is login user. And because we passed the root reducer as the parameter to this store, the reducer that you saw earlier will handle this action and change the state of login to be true. You can also get the state of the store at any time by calling store.getState. So in this example, after we dispatch the login action, we can get the new state by calling store.getState, and we'll have the new state of our entire application. It's important to notice here too that Redux is synchronous. So unlike setState in React, which may take some time to change the application's view, store.dispatch is synchronous. So as soon as that function runs and it's finished, you know that the state has been updated to the new state. The store also allows for listening for changes. So you can add a callback function like the one seen here, the change callback, and then call store.listen and pass in that callback. So anytime a state change happens in the entire store, this function will get invoked, and then you can call store.getState from within that function to figure out what the current state is. In this example, we're just logging it using console.log. If you ever want to cancel that change callback, you'll get a function as a return from the listen function. And this unsubscribe function is what you would invoke to unsubscribe. So if you remember back to set timeout or set interval, we got an ID that we use to cancel the timeout or the set interval. But here we have a function that we use. So whenever we want to stop that callback from happening, we just invoke the unsubscribe function. Let's review the data flow in Redux step by step. Assuming we have a store set up with some state, the first thing that will happen to affect the state is that an action will be dispatched. Now remember, that action always has a type. Once the action is dispatched, the reducer gets invoked. And the first parameter to the reducer is the current state, whatever the store currently has. The second parameter is the action that was just dispatched, including the type. Now based on that type and whatever the state currently is, the reducer returns a new state object. And then after we get that new state, the store invokes all the listeners, which tells any listeners that the store has been updated. So we've just covered the majority of the Redux library. Next up, we'll look at how to integrate it into React.